Hi, my name's John Loomis. I'm from the United States. My educational background is a bachelor's in political science and philosophy from American University. I have 2 masters, one in environmental management from Positivo University. I have an environmental engineering degree from Trier University of Applied Sciences and a doctorate in environmental management from Positivo University. So my professional background has included stints at think tanks in Washington, D.C., such as the German Marshall Fund, Institute for the Study of War. I also had the opportunity to intern for my U.S. Senator. I've worked on a couple political campaigns in Washington, D.C. and Virginia, and then also had the opportunity to work for the U.S. Department of Defense at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. So what are the impacts of trade agreements on... recently, I guess in the last 20 years, we've seen sort of a shift away from trade agreements, less trade liberalization, and more protectionism, more tariffs. The last major trade agreement with the WTO, I'm thinking here, is 1994 in Uruguay. So recently we've seen more regionalization, but even still we've had a lot of holdups. I mean, the example with Mercosur and EU has finally passed after 20 years in 2019, but now is on hold due to some of the political, environmental questions with the current administration in Brazil. So we've seen a shift away from greater trade liberalization, but of course, further trade agreements always helps, in general, helps the consumer. You'll have winners and losers in any country. A big question from the United States perspective with trade agreements is always the shift away from manufacturing jobs that get shifted away to China, to Mexico in the case of NAFTA. So you have it's a shift that comes with globalization, a shift from industrial economy to the knowledge economy. Environmentally, I'm coming from the environmental sciences. Sometimes we have to be concerned about some of these trade agreements from the environmental and social aspects, especially because we have to make sure that countries that are entering into these trade agreements have, the right environmental regulations, environmental protections. Worker protections is also a big concern. So that is also another challenge for negotiating these trade agreements that governments, in the 80s and 90s didn't have such a strong civil society pushing for environmental and social protections. Yeah, so we've seen a big rise in populisms and nationalism. We can see it with Trump in the United States, Bolsonaro in Brazil. We had populism to a lesser extent with Boris Johnson, who recently lost his job in the UK. And with that has become this sort of drive to go back to the way things were, this drive for this glorified past that, some might argue never really existed, this idea of this mythical post-World War II North America, where the United States was number one. We had all these great manufacturing jobs. And so the idea is, if we can get back to that, with that, then we need to protect our own industries. And so that's why you've had, during the Trump administration, you had the big tariff war between the United States and China. And so, we've seen, with the populism geared toward the segment of each population that have often been the losers of globalization. So these are people from the middle, lower classes, in the case of the United States, where their manufacturing jobs were being shipped overseas. This populism, this nationalism went hand in hand with protectionism. So let's try and get these jobs back, even though they're already gone. The economy of the United States has shifted from industrial to more of a financial, knowledge-based economy. And so the idea is that if we could somehow, raise the costs for new companies trying to enter, or we could create a new industrial policy to protect these manufacturing jobs. Then we could keep the jobs here at home, versus what I think is really needed is investment in new worker training, get them prepared for the new jobs. If they want to go for manufacturing, look at green industries, solar panels, wind turbines. These are the sort of manufacturing jobs that can be done. There are high-tech manufacturing jobs that can be done in countries like the United States. All right. Yeah, so with globalization, with the increased globalization came a loss of national sovereignty. And during the 80s, 90s, especially post-Cold War, where we had sort of the unipolar moment with the U.S., so far out ahead of the other countries, we had a real big push, with neoliberalism to bring down trade barriers, further integration, and this was often to the benefit of the United States, to Europe, but then more recently with globalization, starting especially the first decade of the 21st century and now the second decade, we start to see the real impacts of that shift, the loss of manufacturing jobs. And so with that loss and those losers then having political repercussions in the form of growing populism in the United States and other countries in Europe as well, then we see a shift, sort of a reaction against globalization, right? Seen as this elite phenomenon, right? Not for the middle class, everyday Joe worker. And so with that, then we have, rising protectionism, or sort of, as you mentioned, a fragmentation, right? We can see that if we just compare the response to the COVID-19 pandemic compared to the financial crisis 2008. Financial crisis 2008, G20 gets together immediately and starts hatching a plan to try and calm markets, versus the COVID-19, we didn't have that big global response. We saw a lot of countries retrench, even in Europe, which is the most integrated political monetary bloc. Even those countries retrenched into sort of nationalist protectionism. We saw nationalism with the big vaccine boost. Was it going to be an American vaccine, a British vaccine, a Russian vaccine, a Chinese vaccine? So we've seen sort of that fragmentation. And so with that, you could say, there's been a decline in unilateralism, or not a decline in unilateral, a decline in multilateralism. And there's been a real challenge lately to the global institutions. We can see that with the rise of China. And so that's been a challenge now as we move into a new phase of globalization. I don't think globalization will stop even with the pandemic, but it's shifting. And so we'll see sort of that strain of fragmentation, but at the same time, the march by companies for pushing the doors open to more markets, new economies. I don't think you can stop that. Yeah, so neoliberalism really develops in the 70s. We have post World War II Europe, 50s, 60s. Ever since the New Deal with FDR, where we sort of have that development policy where the government should be a part of guiding economic development. We see that happen here in Brazil as well during that phase. But that sort of reaches its end point in the 70s in the United States. We start seeing a lot of inflation. And then the idea is, okay, let's take the government out, let the market will decide what's best, where the investment should go for strategic investments like infrastructure, education, that sort of thing. Let the market decide. And so what happens then with that is you get a lot of public services becoming privatized, and you get a lot of financialization of the economy. So if everything's by the market and it's profit driven, then it becomes a lot about, okay, how can we financialize, the different stock options of companies? And with that, then at the same time, there's never a clean, perfect, competitive market. So the people most benefiting from this will then lobby to make sure that the new regulations or the less regulations will continually benefit them. And so neoliberalism, helps unleash globalization, reduce market barriers. But now more recently, especially with the Biden administration in the United States, we're seeing sort of a return to industrial policy to think about, okay, how can the government strategically invest in areas like renewable energy, for example, to make sure we get that transition that we need, especially in the climate change crisis. Yeah, I think the coronavirus showed the failure of multilateralism, which is worrying because I keep thinking it in the climate change crisis scenario, because in both cases, no one country can go it alone. You need collaboration. And with the coronavirus, we saw a lot of countries sort of shut in, or we had the nationalist sort of vaccine programs. We still see the benefits of soft power with the coronavirus pandemic. So the development of these vaccines led a lot by US pharmaceutical companies, British pharmaceutical companies. So we still see a real, that helps drive their soft power, the influence that they have in the world. But for a multilateral collaborative perspective, we did not see the global community come together to handle. And we were lucky this time because the mortality of this virus wasn't as high as other viruses. But it's sort of a wake-up call, especially in the climate change crisis, that we need to build stronger global institutions to be able to handle these sort of international crises. So the U.S. Hegemony that the U.S. has enjoyed since the end of the Cold War, I'd argue until probably the 2006, 2007, when the Iraq War started to go awry. So we're seeing a shift. So we had the bipolar world order with the Cold War. Then we had the unilateral moment with the end of the Cold War, fall of the Soviet Union. And now we're entering into a multipolar world with the rise of China principally, but other powers like India. Russia continues to be a major power, even though it's declining major power. The EU can be considered a major power, more from a soft power perspective, not the hard military power. But so in that shift, there's always then between any different world order system, from the unipolar to the multipolar now, the different actors are sort of figuring out, okay, what are the new rules of the system? We saw that, during from World War I, World War II into the Cold War, we saw that shift with the Cold War. So what were the sort of balanced power that the US and Soviet Union were fighting out? Now we see it, with China, the US. We see regional powers like Brazil, for example, in Latin America, the EU. So now essentially the influence that the US is going to have to be able to drive world events is going to be much lower. They have to be much more strategic of thinking about, okay, what's in the core national interest of the US? Can I go about, fighting every single conflict? So starting with the Obama administration and now more with the Biden administration, we see a shift of trying to retreat a bit, especially in the Middle East, and put more attention on the Pacific, right? Where that's, the rise of China, and thinking about, okay, how do we, I wouldn't say contain, but how do we meet China, right? With the new rise of them as a new power. So essentially US hegemony will be, need to involve much more multilateralism, have to use much more soft power, or some say smart power, combining hard power and soft power intelligently, because the U.S. isn't going to be able to simply, push and bully the other countries around like it did. We see the limits. We see now the real power the U.S. has, especially is in the financial system, with the dollar being the core currency of the world. We've seen that with the sanctions now on Russia, saw it with the sanctions on Iran that brought Iran to the negotiating table. But the world, I mean, China, especially the EU as well, they're looking to shift away, because they're seeing, their dependency on the dollar makes them very vulnerable, makes their economies very vulnerable with the world being so interconnected now. So for U.S. hegemony, it's going to have to be more of a shift to collaborate with allies in the future. Yeah, so the rise of China is inevitable. Their economy continues to grow. I mean, we've seen a slowdown, but it's going to continue to grow and replace the U.S. as the largest economy, say, before mid-century. For the region, recently we've seen a lot of other countries becoming very nervous, just with their aggressiveness in like the South China Sea, with Taiwan, we've seen recently in the news. And so that's sort of actually been to the United States benefit because these countries are looking to the U.S. for protection. Japan, Korea, see Vietnam even, an old U.S. enemy that's become closer, especially in commercial ties with the United States. We've seen sort of the new Quad, as they've been called, which has been this sort of informal alliance between India, Australia, Japan, and the U.S., which China sees as essentially a four-power alliance to contain them. But worryingly, I mean, we see tensions rising. Like Japan is talking about militarizing again, which was unthinkable after the Second World War. From the U.S. strategic point of view, I don't think it should be worrying to have allies start to invest more in their own militaries. Globally, I think China can be a positive contribution. I think the U.S., Europe, they have to really think about how do we integrate China more into the institutions. China's rising economic power. They want to play a bigger part in the institutions. They're not trying to replace IMF, WTO, World Bank. They just want to play a more dominant role. And so if the U.S. and Europe want to protect the liberal order that they created after World War II, they're going to have to open up the space, especially to China, but we can think of other regional powers like South Africa, Brazil as well, if they want to strengthen the institutions that ultimately benefit the U.S. and Europe so much. Yeah, the talk of a new Cold War between the U.S. and China, I don't think it's reached that point yet. If we think about the Cold War between the U.S. and Soviet Union, there was a real ideological difference. And sure, China's technically communist, but in many aspects, they're more capitalist than even the Americans. And they benefit, and they're more integrated into the world economic system than the Soviet Union ever was. So from a starting point, the U.S. and China are just more integrated commercially than the U.S. and Soviet Union ever were. So yeah, there's going to be trade disputes and trade wars, which started with Trump. And surprisingly, the Biden administration hasn't reversed many of those tariff policies, which is ironic given the inflation challenge in the United States. An easy way to reduce inflation would be to reduce the actual cost of imports into the country. But that's another topic. But as far as the trade war between the U.S. and China, I think it's important that the U.S. and China think about, and for the U.S. strategically, they need China for a lot of different issues, whether it's climate change, whether it's the current Ukraine crisis. And so they need to think about where to pick their battles with China. And I think reducing some of these tariffs and understanding that the rationale for putting these tariffs on Chinese imports could really be better handled with investments, domestic investments by the U.S. Into their infrastructure, into worker training programs, into new technologies. I mean, we've seen that recently. The U.S. passed the CHIPS Act, so trying to pull more manufacturing of microchips used for computers in the U.S. Away from principally Taiwan. And then the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the biggest investment in green technology in U.S. history. So those sort of investments at home, I think, are more beneficial. And then also you can reduce the trade tensions with China, because ultimately this century is going to be characterized by the relations between China and the U.S., with China the rising power, U.S. not necessarily declining power, but China is going to surpass the U.S. How does it change the balance of forces in international affairs? So the Ukraine crisis, I mean, is the first major land war we're seeing, since World War II, essentially, in Europe. I don't think it changes necessarily the balance of forces. It just shows that Russia's a declining power. They're sort of a spoiler state. I think U.S. needs to be careful when they're considering how to respond in the Ukraine crisis, and then looking over to Taiwan, which is some of drawn parallels with China and Taiwan, Russia and Ukraine. It also shows, for as far as considering balances of forces of power, that sort of thing, I think everyone was impressed by, and continues to be impressed by, Ukraine's ability to resist. Another example of sort of maybe a proxy war, sort of getting to that point of a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia, or the U.S. and its European allies and Russia, with just feeding arms, intelligence into Ukraine to raise the cost of war for Russia, which I think is a necessary thing, because if Russia is able to succeed in Ukraine at relatively low cost, which they thought they would be, it could be an incentive for other countries elsewhere, looking at China and Taiwan, to see, okay, what are the costs of invasion of another country? And so I think we see the cost of a land invasion like that is actually much higher than we expected. But of course, Russia's military versus China's military, I think, are two totally different things. So we've seen the impacts of climate change manifest themselves now in migration crisis and political crisis. We see that a lot in Africa with the shifts in climate regimes, so rainfall regimes principally shifting where the most fertile lands for agriculture, for cattle raising, and sometimes the areas for cattle raising shift into areas that are more fertile for traditionally agricultural lands, and then you have people fighting over smaller spaces of land that are habitable, which has already brought us some what people have dubbed the climate wars. In the Southeast Pacific, we've already started to see the rising sea levels push people to look for migrating into other countries. In the Middle East, a lot of the droughts, people argue that the Arab Spring in 2011 was the result of severe droughts in the previous years. So there's a clear connection between changing climate conditions with migration. I think it's going to only increase. So again, it just means that countries are going to have to think about collaborating versus building walls. So looking at, it's often going to be cheaper to invest in another country, help them build the infrastructure they need, versus trying to just protect your own borders. Because similarly, putting in a new seawall in New York City is going to be much more expensive than trying to actually reduce and mitigate climate change.